Welcome back to the Literacy Lunch Break. I'm your host, Marjorie Bottari, and I am so excited to be joined by Dr. Steve Graham today. He is going to share some practical tips for writing instruction with us. But before we jump into those tips, Dr. Graham, we would love for you just to give a little background about yourself and then share, really what got you interested in researching writing and how that's evolved over time.
Thank you for inviting me on the show today. I work at Arizona State University, probably in my 44th or 45th year as a university professor. I was formerly a special education teacher. I've been at Arizona State for about 12 years. I was at Vanderbilt before that, University of Maryland forever, about 23 years, and Purdue and Auburn. So I popped around a little bit. I actually became interested in writing when I was a doctoral student at the University of Kansas. I never felt that I was a very good writer. I had some evidence to support that based on college English courses that I took. And my real interest and the primary reason I wanted to pursue a doctorate was to learn how to be a better teacher of reading. That's mostly what I was working with in terms of the students with special needs that I saw every day. And I wasn't sure if I would go back to teaching, but that was the plan initially. But then I got interested in research. Now, I'm going to tell a failure story that actually turns out to be a little bit of a success story. It's not a complete failure, but my dissertation was a federally funded grant, which was great because it gave me money to do it. And I was successful in doing the defense of it, et cetera. But my minor person, who was in the area of reading and not in special education, said to me, "Steve, you could have done better than this." And, that's not really what you want to hear at the end of a dissertation. She said it privately. She was very nice about it. And she, when I reworked my dissertation with the comments from the committee, she was the most helpful committee member. So I don't want to throw her under the bus
Right,
here.
yeah.
But it made me realize that what I really was interested wasn't reading so much anymore. It was writing. And the reason for that was I was having to write myself. And at the same time, I was reading reviews in the Paris Review where they would interview people, famous writers like Steinbeck and Mailer and other people, about the processes that they engaged in when they wrote. Now, those interviews included other stuff, but I realized I was fascinated with this. And it coincided with this idea that now I have to write. And, I wasn't exactly sure if this was something that I would be good at. And so what I ended up doing is in a 3-year period, I did a major review each year. The first one starting with composition, going back as far as I could. I was originally a history major in undergraduate school, so I like to know the history of things. And then because I was working with kids with special needs, I also did one on handwriting and spelling because most of the kids I had worked with had a great deal of difficulty with that. But that gave me the foundation for moving forward. So it was really kind of a personal interest, with kind of a negative comment that really prompted me to move forward. And that's probably the worst time to decide to make a change because I'm taking a job in academia.
Right. Yeah.
Usually you have some idea of what you're going to do. And all of a sudden I was kind of cutting myself loose from what my plans were. But, I obviously must have liked it because 40 something years later,
it worked out, didn't it?
Yeah, I'm still doing work in the area.
Yeah, I love that you shared that story. And I think it's really great for our listeners to hear as well, because as we've been talking about with this series, I think, and you just mentioned you started out really trying to help support reading. And then you just kind of recognized this importance of writing, and both for yourself as a writer, and then of course for students as writers. And that's something we've been talking a lot about in this series, right? We know the importance of tightening up our reading instruction. We know the importance of, really providing explicit and systematic instruction in reading. But I think many educators are kind of uncomfortable teaching writing. I mean, I've shared before, I started my teaching career as a 6th grade reading and language arts teacher. And the writing for me was more, I feel like I gave more assignments versus actual instruction. Because I wasn't as comfortable with it. um, so that's why this is so important, and we're so grateful for your work. So I think that'll help me jump into that next question. You have written a book called Best Practices in Writing Instruction. Um, can't capture the whole thing here, but for our listeners, can you maybe share some of those key components of high quality writing when you're looking for a program of high quality writing programs?
Yeah. So I'm going to go a little bit beyond
Yeah,
the book that we've been working on over the years. There's actually a third edition coming out
great.
sometime in the near future. Um, we've done a lot of meta-analysis, taking a look at both the elementary level and the secondary level of what works from an evidence-based perspective. And I'm going to suggest four things that are based on kind of traditional scientific research with randomized controlled trials or quasi experiments. But another recommendation based on a synthesis that we did, taking a look at teachers who had there was evidence that they were really effective literacy teachers and what they did in writing, because this fifth kind of recommendation is a little bit harder to get at in terms of more traditional quantitative work. I can summarize it in 5 words: write, support, teach, connect, and create. And so, what do I mean by those 5 words? So, one of the things that's very important is that students are engaged in writing. That's the game, right?
Right.
There's no reason to be doing this if students aren't producing text and for meaningful and real purposes.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when I say that, it's not enough. Okay, so we just completed a meta-analysis at the secondary level, grades 6 to 12, and another one at the elementary level, which hasn't been published yet. But in both of those, we did not see that increasing the amount of time students write made a difference
Right.
in the overall quality of their writing over time.
Mm-hmm.
However, we do have evidence that when students write about what they read, they understand it better. When they write about what they're learning in science, social studies, and math, they understand that material better and remember it better. In addition, there's some evidence with elementary grade students that when you increase how much students write, their reading comprehension improves, even on norm reference tests, which is really hard to move the needle on.
Yeah.
So that's one of the things. We want to have kids in the game. We want to have
Mhm.
them playing there, and we want to do it for real purposes. A second thing is that teachers can, and it doesn't matter if we're talking about school or outside of school, kids need support as they're learning to write. And there's a lot of different kinds of support that are proven to be effective. And those can include things like helping students set goals or providing goals for them in terms of what they're trying to achieve. Now, ultimately, we would like for students to come up with their own goals, but sometimes they have difficulties
Right.
being clear about what they want to do. So providing a goal can be useful. Having kids gather information through either through inquiry, through graphic organizers, or through reading before writing can be helpful. Providing feedback, peer, teacher, even computer feedback, we're finding now can be effective, as well as teaching students to, self-feedback. The use of digital tools provide affordances that weren't there before. They can
Right.
get feedback. They can help you plan. They make it easier in terms of producing text because of word processing or speech-to-text synthesis. So I'm not going to keep going down the road on this because there's other things that I could add here. But the third thing is we need to teach. And so what is it that we need to teach? Because there's a lot. This is a complex skill. There's a lot we could teach. For young kids, we need to be sure that we teach handwriting, spelling, and now I think keyboarding. And that should occur in the first 3 grades. But for kids who find writing particularly difficult, that might extend into as far as middle school. We need to, and this is something we're not doing a good job of, we need to devote more time to teaching students to become more facile in terms of turning their ideas into sentences, from simple to more complex sentences. And we need to teach kids strategies for planning, drafting, evaluating, and revising their papers. We also want to connect, and I mentioned this already in a way, reading, writing, and learning. And so we have considerable evidence that when you teach reading and students do more reading, they become better writers. And vice versa, as I mentioned the other way, when we increase writing and we teach writing, students become better readers. And obviously, the punchline here is that the reason that we engage in this skill, we teach kids to do these skills in school, is as a tool for learning. We use reading to acquire information. We use writing to help us think more about that
Yeah.
information. And then the final thing from the study of, exceptional teachers, literacy teachers, what we see is they create an environment in which students can flourish as writers. Writing is valued, students' products are valued, students are treated as the owner of the material that they produce. We see a lot of materials on the walls with young
Hmm.
kids. We see anthologies produced by the classroom with older kids. So we need to create an environment in which students are motivated, encouraged to write, and can flourish as writers. So, that's my big five with a little
Yeah.
bit of elaboration.
That's great. I mean, to be able to sum it up into five, I think is great. And as you said, that's a summary. As we think about all of those five, there's a lot that goes into each one. As I was listening to you speak, you talked about handwriting and spelling, and I feel like, yes, okay, if I'm a writing teacher, I think many teachers are kind of comfortable with that side. But then as you start to really talk about generating sentences and, moving beyond those sentences, but just even talking about sentences from simple to more complex, or as we start to think about the different types of writing and that explicit teach portion of those five steps, I think that's where writing gets a little bit tricky for some of our educators, is because there aren't a lot of programs out there that will help teach writing explicitly with all of those components. And again, I think so many of us may feel uncomfortable with teaching. What does teaching writing look like? How do I get to all of those components? So as we think about that, I would love for you to share maybe some strategies that you have to help younger students really improve those writing skills. We handwriting, spelling, but we can talk about that a little bit, but I am really interested in that sentence construction, because I really feel like that's sometimes where it really starts to become a little more complex.
Here's the fortunate news. We've actually had evidence on effective practices for teaching sentence construction skills since the 1980s.
Yeah.
And so one of the tools that has been most effective is sentence combining. And I'll
Mhm.
define that in a minute. But it came out of work by linguists. In the early to late 1980s, they developed programs around it. And then all of a sudden, whole language came along, which emphasized not teaching so much, but that writing could be acquired naturally by
Mhm.
engaging students in meaningful um, writing for real purposes. And I do think it's important to do that,
Absolutely.
but it's not enough. And
Mhm.
so sentence combining disappeared from the landscape for the most part. There used to be these great programs that you could use, etc. Now, what sentence combining involves is a teacher modeling how to take two smaller sentences, or kernel sentences, as we might call them, and combining them into a more complex sentence. The dog is big, the dog is black. So for a little kid, okay, both of these sentences say the dog. I might have it written on the board. I cross out one of the dogs. The dog is big, and I can combine that, and black, or the big dog is black. So I might demonstrate multiple ways of doing that. And then I provide students with similar sentences that we work together to combine. And then what we do in our own work is we have students work together to combine sentences of the same nature. And then we have them, and I think this is really critical, apply the skill in their writing, whether it's
Yes.
revising or creating new text. And this seems to be something that, it kind of muddles my mind a little bit. But if you want students to apply something in the context in which they're
Yeah.
working, you have to provide those opportunities. We often apply what I think of as a hope and pray. We teach a skill and we hope and pray that they'll use it in
Yes.
their
Mhm.
writing. And when they don't, we're stunned, and we shouldn't be,
Right.
because kids don't always know while they're learning these skills in schools. They're for application and your writing. So when we do sentence combining, there's a couple of positive advantages. One is that we see students, as we work on this across the year, students' sentences become more complex. So we wouldn't be stuck on those. We would be moving to other things with subordination, etc. A second advantage is you don't have to go through all this rigmarole of the jargon around grammar. I'm not saying that's a bad thing, knowing what pieces of grammar are, but with sentence construction or sentence combining, you don't have to have all of that. You don't have to talk about, subjective parts of sentences, etc. Basically, you model how to do this, and you give students practice doing it. A third advantage is that we know that there is some improvement in grammar, and traditional grammar practices that have not been effective, especially for young kids. And then the fourth thing is that we see that the overall quality of students' writing improves, probably because they're not having to devote so much effort and resources to the sentence aspect when they're writing. And a way of thinking about sentences is that then it's not like handwriting and spelling. You don't want it to become automatic, right? It's a thinking process. So we want students to become facile, and at the end point, their sentences convey their intended meaning in ways that are comprehensible to the reader and grammatically correct. And so that's really the goal, and that tends to be a pretty effective procedure. For slightly younger kids, things like sentence expansion, where we might give a sentence like, "The dog bit the mailman." Okay, so you understand what that means, but you can see how kids can help you add adjectives or describing words to make that more interesting. You model it, same kind of thing. They practice it, they apply it in their writing. And, we can do that with multiple aspects of grammar, not just with we can do adverbs, we can do adjectives, we can add on objects, etc., to that sentence expansion idea, or where we have sentence frames where the first part of a sentence is available and we help kids spell out the last part, or vice versa. We have the last part available. So we have tools that we can use. Now, I don't usually do this, but I'm going to mention something that should still be free for people who are interested in sentence combining, and that's a program by Quill. And Quill is a digital-based program for sentence combining put together by some young entrepreneurs a couple of years ago in New York City. And I think it's a really interesting approach they did to this. So they crowdsourced combining sentences to lots of people. And then from the ways that those sentences were combined, they made a human judgment about, say, like the best 2 or 3 combinations. And then their digital program, basically, depending upon what you do, as you start combining it, it prompts you towards one of those solutions.
Wow.
And so, it gives you individual feedback. And, the biggest problem with sentence combining for teachers is they have to generate the sentences.
Right.
So it's time consuming.
Yes.
So, we don't still have those programs available like we did in the 1980s. So usually I do not recommend products, but they're a nonprofit. They do sell to schools, but my understanding is that everything is free to individual teachers. So it's Quill, simple as that.
All right.
And they develop some other tools that are interesting as well.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that, because that's exactly what our listeners need. That's what teachers need, right? Is something that they're listening to this and they're saying, okay, yes, I love how you talked about, spelling and handwriting, and we want that to be automatic, right? Like that's something we're just doing. But, that writing and sentence writing, combining sentences, that's a thinking task. That's something we really do have to, that's a heavier lift, and we need it to be. We need them to be thinking about that. So if this is something that teachers are listening to and they want to try it, I would love for them to have a resource that they can go directly to and use. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, do you mind if I add one more thing to that?
Oh, not at all.
So I think one of the reasons why I spent as much time on this as I did is if you look at Common Core state standards, which 46 states adopted, you don't see sentence construction
Yeah.
in there.
Hmm.
If you take a look or think about what you do as a writer, I would say about 80% of your effort is at the sentence level. I mean, you may have a general idea of where you're going in your head, but a lot of your mental effort is taking ideas and transforming those into sentences
Yeah.
that convey your intended meaning.
Mhm.
And we just do not devote enough attention to that.
No, absolutely. This is again, love it. And this is when I wish I was still in the classroom so I could turn around and go try all of all of what you shared. I am going to ask one more question. As we're thinking about writing, and you just talked about, that thinking process as we're thinking about what we want to convey, what that message is at that sentence level. As we think about our English language learners, we know that that can obviously be a heavier lift. So, as you think about English language learners, or as you have shared, students with special needs with your experience, how do you have any different recommendations of how to approach or support their needs as we think about supporting all learners' needs within a classroom?
So, from an empirical base, from an evidence base, this is really a difficult question.
Hmm.
And I'm actually going to share two things with you and then make some recommendations. I'm going to step outside writing for a second and talk about reading. We did a meta-analysis a couple of years ago, taking a look at teaching reading to students in the U.S., okay, who, had some identification as being English language learners. One of the problems in some of the research is that, especially the early research, if kids were Spanish, they were considered English language learners.
Hmm.
That was a mistake. About 50% of kids who come from Hispanic households in this country are fluent with English.
Yeah.
So when you take a look at, kids who have been designated by their school or in
Hmm.
programs for helping them to acquire English, and you look just at reading, not at oral language development, it's disappointing. The big five, as we think of in reading, in terms of phonological awareness, fluency, vocabulary, reading comprehension, and I'm missing
Phonics.
something here.
Yep, phonics. Yep.
But you got the idea.
Yep.
The effect sizes are about 0.20, which is very
Wow.
small.
Yeah.
And it's not just our meta-analysis, but other ones. But it got me thinking about what do we know in terms of teaching writing to English language learners in the U.S.,
Hmm.
not in Pakistan, not somewhere
Right.
else, but
Right.
U.S.
Yeah.
And we found 20 studies total. It's really shocking. And
Wow.
11 or 12 of those are dissertations. So one of the things is we're not seeing this being prioritized
Hmm.
by the federal funding agencies. And it's unfortunate because writing is a complex skill and it's difficult. Now, what would I say here in terms of this? If you think about language development, so one of the ways of thinking about, being an English language learner, say maybe you're coming in with Spanish as your language that you've learned at home, and let's say you're an immigrant to this country, and that's the language and you're learning English in school. You would hope that you'd be able to take some advantage of Spanish
Right.
as a way of helping you read or write, right? Because
Hmm.
there are some similarities between them, and reading and writing have underlying processes
Hmm.
that are not going to be radically different
Right.
in the different languages. So when you think about language transfer, one of the things that has shown up again and again when you look at language generally, not reading or writing, is that transfer depends upon how well you speak your current language,
Yes.
as well as how much of your new language you've learned. I suspect that also applies to writing and reading as
Right.
well. So that's something to keep in mind. So the more you know of English when you're a Spanish speaker, the more likely you'd be able to apply those language skills. A second thing that we did not see a lot of in the studies that we looked at, even in reading, is we did not see a lot of taking advantage of that first language
Yes.
into second language. So, you can write in your first language and then look to convert some of that to the second language, or you can use both as you write, which
Exactly.
to me
Yes.
makes really great sense.
Hmm.
A third thing, and I think this is particularly important, there are some skills that doesn't matter that much about language, handwriting and spelling. Well, I shouldn't say that. Let me back up. Handwriting and typing, spelling can matter depending upon the language and its transparency. But also things, general approaches like planning and revising. You can teach strategies that can be applied in both languages.
Yes.
And there may be some advantages. We don't know this at this point for teaching in the first language how to plan and then using it to help you in the second language.
Hmm.
So if I'm teaching a general strategy for planning a persuasive text, it might be as simple as this, is that you generate ideas on both sides of the topic, or if there's three sides, it's fine. Then you decide which side of the topic you want to defend. Since you've generated ideas on both sides, that gives you a
Right.
source for pulling ideas from. You decide which are most convincing and which ones need to be refuted. And then you keep planning as you write. That's a general basic strategy for planning and drafting that works in any language. It doesn't matter. And so there are things that we can teach that cut across language. The use of language, though, from one first to second language or third language will depend somewhat on your mastery in both of those languages.
Hmm.
But there is a lot that we can take advantage of, even though we don't have as strong of evidence base as we'd like now.
Yeah, that
So,
was,
that would be one of my advices
yeah.
is teach the things that transfer because those are going to be helpful. And strategy instruction around planning, particularly, and revising also can be powerful in either language.
Yeah, I love that because you're right. It's such a challenging question. You talked in such great detail, and I think that's really helpful and important for us to talk about is the lack of research and then the way we identify English language learners, right? You check that box that there's another language spoken at home, and then all of a sudden you're an English language learner when in your native language you might not even be solid, right? That is something we see a lot in classrooms now, right? A little bit of Spanish, a little bit of English, and that you really do want a foundation in one language, as you said, to transfer and that these skills are across languages, right? The skills that we use to generate ideas, to organize. Even as we think about decoding and encoding. Yes, the orthography might not be as transparent, but the process for decoding is blending parts, sounds or syllables together, or we segment when we spell. So those are strategies that we can be teaching across languages. That was very, very helpful. And I feel like it could be its own podcast, just talking about those. But Dr. Graham, I want to just thank you so much for being a guest today. I think our listeners are going to benefit so greatly from listening to you and your experience and your research. And then there will be lots more resources shared in our show notes along with your book and quill. So thank you for sharing that resource. And again, thank you so much for being a guest today.
Thank you very much for asking me, and I enjoyed it. Thank you.
Be sure to subscribe and stay tuned for our upcoming episodes where we explore literacy topics in a snack-sized, easily digestible format.